Episode 69, Swag by Elmore Leonard. Welcome back to Point Blank. My name is Kurt, and joining me today is Justin. We're going to be discussing Elmore Leonard and the book Swag. Elmore Leonard is the poet laureate of wild assholes with revolvers. Justin, are you excited to talk about Leonard today?
I am, and I'm still kind of shocked that we made it this far in a crime fiction podcast series without giving Elmore Leonard his due.
Yeah.
There are probably several reasons for that, but it is still, with all those reasons being known to us, it's still surprising that it's taken this long. But we're here, and I'm happy to be talking about Leonard today, and especially the book Swag, which I'm sure we will both have plenty to talk about.
That's true, Justin. It is hard to believe that we've made it this far without getting to Leonard. But, you know, in a way that kind of brings me back to what the purpose of the show is. And a lot of times, you know, we try to approach, or, you know, sometimes we try to approach this media as if we're reading it for the first time. What are our impressions of what it is we're reading? What are we learning about crime fiction by reading it? So we're not, you know, you and I are generalists in this topic. We don't dive deep into one particular author or series or time frame or any of those sorts of things. So Leonard is almost a body of work by itself. So, you know, if you're listening and you're an Elmore Leonard fan, you've read everything, you know, we're not coming from it from that perspective. We're just taking the first taste, really, of Elmore Leonard. And one of the reasons I think we haven't gotten to it on this show is, you know, I think you and I have both been exposed to Leonard's work before even thinking about this podcast, whether it be film or probably his books as well.
Well, I'll add this. Frankly, it's hard not to be exposed to Elmore Leonard's work, even if you're a layperson or a non-reader, given the number of his books that were turned into films and especially popularized by folks like Quentin Tarantino in the 90s. So even if you don't know Elmore Leonard, you might know Elmore Leonard. I mean, if you've watched Justified, you're not going to inherently know that Elmore Leonard is the author or creator of the Raylan character. So he's everywhere, especially in the last couple decades of his life. He passed away in 2013, so he's no longer with us. But his body of work, as much as we might think it was really the 90s and the 2000s where he became known, that's accurate, but he was writing starting in 1951. So this guy had a long career, largely unheralded until you know his later years. So we have a lot to talk about in terms of that, just his pure staying power of sticking to his guns when it comes to writing. And a lot of guns there were.
Yes, yeah, there's a lot of guns. But yeah, so that's why it's taken us a while, I think. And the other thing too is, you know, you and I both get like going, you know, exposing some authors that people aren't familiar with. And Leonard is such a quintessential crime fiction author. It's a shame we haven't covered him, but it's also reasonable of why we've sort of avoided him. But we did choose Swag today. But before we get into that, Justin, do you have any announcements or anything you want to talk about?
I wanted to do a shout out to G. Weaver, who's a listener, for recently contributing to our Patreon this month. I just wanted to acknowledge that on the air. G. Weaver, we thank you for your contribution. And anybody else who's interested in helping us out, maintaining our website costs and whatnot, feel free to check out our Patreon page. Cheers to G. Weaver on that. Otherwise, I don't have anything major. I just started the semester, so I'm back to the grind, so to speak, and I'm adjusting to you know the new workload, and that's okay. I'm a little tired today, but I do feel like being able to talk about this book will reinvigorate me, because it's one of those taut, fast-paced crime fiction pieces that really speak to me in my caffeine-fueled, tempo.
It is going to be exciting to get into this one and talk about some of the, the reason why Leonard has so many books and so many of them are very popular, and also why such a huge percentage of his work has been brought to the screen, either on TV or film. Justin, would you like to, as usual, start us off with a brief summary of the book Swag?
Yeah, we can call it brief, but that won't be necessarily an accurate description. But I will give us some foundations that we can take off from there. So here's my summary. We all know Elmore Leonard. If you're watching this podcast or listening to this podcast, you've heard his name. Swag is a fun, lean crime novel about amateur armed robbers in 1970s Detroit. This one was published in 1976, and this is Leonard's 12th novel, and the first of two novels featuring protagonist Ernest Stickley Jr., the second being Stick, which I thought about reviewing. I read it, but it didn't stick to my bones in the same way that this book did. That came out a few years after Swag. Swag was also published in paperback under the alternative title of Ryan's Rules. So if you have a copy of Ryan's Rules, it's the same book, and it's probably a collector's edition as well. In this book, Swag, we meet unemployed cement truck driver Ernest Stickley Jr., or as he goes by Stick, shortly after his emergence from Jackson Federal Penitentiary. In the opening scene, he's attempting to steal a car from a dealership, only to be stalled by the salesman, whose name is Frank Ryan. This is a funny opening because it already showcases them as maybe not particularly adept at the craft that they're pursuing for the rest of the book, but we'll get to that later. Frank's first impression of Stick is, quote, a guy off the farm who'd come to town and somebody had sold him a genuine Hawaiian sports shirt. Meanwhile, Stick's first impression of Frank is that he's a nice-looking guy, about 35 or so, long hair carefully combed, all dressed up with his suit and tie on, a car salesman. Stick could smell the guy's aftershave lotion. So in these few words, we already get a picture painted of these two guys, these two sort of bumbling would-be criminals and their bromance to come. So in this opening scene, which says a lot about the characters and the setup for the story, Stick gets stopped by Ryan, but then he proceeds. Eventually he gets arrested, and Ryan ends up testifying against him. But at this moment when Frank Ryan can put Stick away for good, he plays dumb and gets him off on a technicality. And thus begins the short, amusing bromance of Stick and Frank as they scheme and strategize ways to live the easy life. And in a lot of ways, that seems to be what they're after in this story, how to enjoy the freewheeling 70s without having to keep a steady, grinding 8-to-5 job. In one of the early scenes, we have them at the bar drinking and sort of talking about what they want out of life. And Frank Ryan has a vision about his future that includes Stick, involving him in his schemes. And we hear of his 10 rules for success and happiness. And Ryan's 10 rules are as follows. Always be polite on the job. Say please and thank you. 2, never say more than necessary. 3, never call your partner by name unless you use a made-up name. 4, dress well. Never look suspicious or like a bum. 5, never use your own car. Details to come. 6, never count the take in the car. 7, never flash money in a bar or with women. 8, never go back to an old bar or hang out once you have moved up. 9, never tell anyone your business. Never tell a junkie even your name. 10, never associate with people known to be in crime. And this last one is very important. From there on out, the novel is an enjoyable ride through the trials and tribulations of these two guys. The early robberies, the good life, the escalation, the breaking of their own rules, the killings, the big heist, the big fail, the twist. In one amusing scene that everybody talks about, Stick and Ryan go into a bar with the intent of robbing it. They are beaten to the punch because there's another guy already in the bar robbing it. They sit there and watch the guy rob the place, and then they walk up to the guy and rob the guy. This scene is pretty funny. It's amusing, and it's smart and incredibly enjoyable. It also plays an incredibly important role in the story itself because there are a whole bunch of witnesses to what's going down in this bar, and one of them returns again later in the story at a critical time. I did find it interesting that Stick ends up only killing black men. Not to say he sought out black men to kill, but that circumstances in the story were that he was in a position where he had to or chose to kill, and the people he chose to kill or needed to kill happened to be black men. I could make something out of this, but I think Leonard is savvy enough to call attention to this issue himself. He kind of presents it as a philosophical problem for Stick. Stick chews on it, he reflects on it, he mills it over, and feels weird and disoriented about it. We don't get any more than that, but we are left with this unresolved discomfort that Stick feels, and I think that was intentional. I'll add this. The critic Newgate Calendar wrote in 1976 about Swag, quote, "Leonard has given us a character study of two criminal types. One is loudmouth, cunning, but not smart, easily swayed, in love with his own importance. The other one is basically suspicious of everything, close-mouthed, tough, kills when necessary, and in many respects is a superior human being. But Leonard never lets us forget that Stick is, after all, a thief." And to this I add the paraphrased words of another critic, Patrick Reardon, who says, "It's rare enough for a crime novel to be told from the perspective of the criminals, let alone that the criminals have complex layered personalities." And I would agree with that. That's one of the charms of this book. My verdict is this, and I've left out a lot of the details, a lot of the specifics about their specific robberies and the heist, but we'll talk about it. My verdict is that I love this book as a dialogue-driven, action-packed, humorous, tragic, weird, very 1970s taut crime tale. If this is Elmore Leonard at his best, then he's pretty good, and I would give this 4.5, maybe even higher than that, but let's say 4.5 stars. I was really impressed by this book. I listened to it 5 or 3 times on audiobook, just walking around my neighborhood, just completely immersed. And I will say that I've read other Leonard stuff, and some of it's good, and some of it I didn't really enjoy. So I was really happy with this choice for the sake of this conversation today, Kurt. What are your thoughts on this book?
Well, I do enjoy this book, Justin, and I hesitate to give it my rating for one major reason, and that is there's a lot to choose from with Leonard. We asked on social media, what should we read? Swag came up a lot between the two of us. We talked about Swag. I read the description of Swag again, and I said, okay, well, let's do this one. This one sounds good. And when I started reading it for the show this time, I realized I've already read the book.
Ha!
That's not really a problem per se, because it is a pretty good book.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, I remember the books I read pretty well. And for me to not remember that I had read this has to bring the rating down a little bit. So I think it's a solid 4, really. It is a good book for the reasons that you state. The dialogue is punchy. I think there's elements to this that we'll get into in Leonard's craft, that he makes something that it can be very complex look very easy. And for that, this is a great book and a great study of those things. But because the book was not memorable, in my personal rating system, I have to bring it down a little bit. So if I'm being fair to the book, it's a 3.5, I think, for me. But that said, I still think it's a very good book.
Okay, I think that's fair. And I mean, I've had that issue happen to me before, where I'm sitting down with a book ready to read, and I get through 20 pages and go, Jesus, this is quite familiar. I remember during my stoner days of my early 20s, I must have read Cat's Cradle, because in my late 20s, I sat down to read it finally, the Vonnegut classic, and it took me I must have been so stoned when I read it that I didn't remember until about 150 pages in. I was like, I feel like this is starting to feel familiar to me. And I was like, oh my God, I totally read this. I read this entire thing. I was so baked that I couldn't even remember the first half of the book. So it does happen. That one was not the fault of the book per se. Sometimes it's our circumstances. So,
well, maybe that's the case with me. Not for that reason, but I don't know. Maybe I'm not sure when I read it before, but it's by the end of, I think, the second chapter, I knew I'd read it already. So I like it, but I do think that it's worth mentioning. The New York Times review said Swag was one of the best of the year, whereas the Kirkus review called it flat and familiar, a 52 pickup letdown. your mileage on this one might vary. And if you like the style of crime fiction that you described well in your summary, Justin, I think people, you're going to like this book, especially with the punchy dialogue.
Well, I think this is a question of, once we get to people like Leonard, we've already had crime fiction as a genre, hardboiled specifically, since the 1920s, and it has truly evolved since the era of Dash Hammett and those Black Mask guys. We have evolved to the point where we have an Elmore Leonard who creates the genre in his own light, in his own vision of the world. And as much as he gets compared to people like Dash Hammett and Ray Chandler, he's not really that kind of writer. And he even agrees with this. He says that there's no similarity in style or subject matter between him and these guys. He says that his influences are more Hemingway, Steinbeck, John O'Hara, and James Cain. And while Hemingway makes sense, but definitely James M. Cain, I would say that it's that tautness and that's that pacing.
Yeah, I would agree. I definitely see the Hemingway connection, especially in the novel that we covered in an earlier episode. In To Have or Have Not, I see a lot of parallels between that book and what we see here in Leonard's style in Swag.
Interesting.
But I mean, there's no doubt about that Leonard is probably is in the list of greatest American authors. If you want to, if you want to put him on that list, I think that would make sense. He is definitely got a style of his own. And like I said earlier, I think the biggest gift that he has is taking, the dialogue and the action. It seems like what he's just doing is just telling you what's happening, like in a very simplified way.
Yeah.
But that is such a difficult thing to do, and he pulls it off very, very well. So let's get into that a little bit and how he does that, maybe as we explore the characters and the plot and stuff like that. So would you like to talk about these characters a little bit?
Well, yeah, I think when I was writing my summary, I was trying to decide if I should include other characters in it. And I chose against that, as much as, there are other characters in this novel beyond Frank and Ernest, but none of them really struck me as being essential in terms of development. More so they were there to help the plot along and to set up the scenarios where the guys end up breaking their own rules. So I'm not sure if you have the same feeling or not, but I would say that Frank Ryan and Ernest Stickley Jr. are really the only characters that truly matter, and everybody else sort of helps to move the story along. Is that a fair assessment, or do you disagree? Am I missing somebody important?
No, I think that's pretty fair. I mean, I think the only thing, there's two characters who I think are worth mentioning beyond Ryan and Stick, and that would be Arlene, who you mentioned is the woman who lives in their apartment building. One of them kind of hooks up with, and she happens, and I guess I'm giving something away here, but she happens to be at that bar that you mentioned in the summary where they rob the robber.
Yeah.
She's there and they don't notice her.
Yeah.
She gets locked
witness.
up.
Yeah.
She is a key witness. So her role is kind of important. And I think it says something about, I don't want to quite call it incompetence, but maybe
blind spot.
Blind spot to how Ryan and Stick operate, and especially they have these rules, these 10 rules that you listed. They don't always stick to them very well. In fact, they don't really at all when it's all said and done.
No, they very much unstick to them, and that's a problem that recurs repeatedly.
The other character worth mentioning is Sport Tree, who's like sort of the gangster or gang boss, whatever you want to say, fixer, who they hook up with to do the big job that culminates in the climax of this book. And I mean, that character doesn't have a lot of, doesn't provide any growth himself or anything like that, but he is the other character I think of note. Everything else is extraneous.
Yeah. I mean, and I think that's legit. Those are the two characters that recur, help them along, create conditions for, essentially they create the conditions for the two guys to break the rules. With Arlene and with Sport Tree, we're both put in predicaments where one of the 10 rules is broken, and that sets up trouble down the road. Now, if you had to pick Frank Ryan, Ernest Stickley Jr., to stick with those two, was there, did you, one of these guys is maybe a little more likable than the other, but sometimes that's pretty debatable. Which guy really spoke to you, or which guy did you feel was more fleshed out, if any?
Well, that's a tough question, Justin, because like you, I also read Stick.
Okay.
The follow-up to this. So it's hard.
So you know what happens, yeah.
Yeah, and we have more context with Stick. But I do think, even just looking at this book, Ernest Stickley Jr., he is the more interesting character. Frank Ryan sort of strikes me as he is a sleazy used car salesman.
Yeah.
But he embodies that sleazy sales guy who wants to get ahead in the world. And in this case, what he's willing to do is armed robbery. Mm-hmm. And he seems a little naive to what he's getting into, even though he thinks he's got it all figured out. He's got his rules. Oh, we're going to beat the system because nobody else has been this, as smart or as smooth as we are. To throw in a plot hole here is, Elmore Leonard, he grew up in Michigan. He knows Detroit well. It's the 70s. These guys are going to go in and rob like liquor stores. Do they not think that the liquor store owners are going to be armed as well? I mean, is that not a thing?
I don't know. It's a fair question, though. I don't know to what extent store owners in the 70s armed themselves in the upper Midwest, but clearly not in this book. And I imagine if we read more of Leonard's Detroit novels, we would start to see a pattern. I can't speak to it right now because this is one of the few Detroit books of his that I've read. But that's worth noting. They get away with a lot and pretty quickly. And what is really a fun ride to watch. I mean, some people call this it's essentially like a manual for how to, commit armed robbery. I wouldn't. Maybe in the 1970s, but I wouldn't call it that now. There's too much surveillance. But
no, you'd never get away with this now.
No, absolutely not. But at the time, to watch them go in, to get a sense of the way they feel, the nerves, the kind of feeling the moment, the calm before the storm, when you're in the convenience store, for example, milling about the gas station aisles right before one of them pulls the gun and tries to commit the robbery. I loved that tension. I thought, that Leonard is incredibly gifted at handling those types of scenes. And to the victor goes the spoils. They start accumulating cash, and then they end up in the swingers apartment with a pool in the courtyard, and they're hanging out with all the sort of like middle-aged women who, whatever, just sort of swinging and flashing their money. And it just feels so utterly 1970s and so carefree and so glorious, through their eyes, like they've really made it. I just enjoyed that whole ride for as brief as it lasted. It was a really fun part of the book that makes this book sort of hard to explain plot-wise. It's just sort of relishing in the successes of amateur armed robbers before the shit hits the fan.
Yeah, and you're right, Justin. I think there is like this, I don't want to say beauty, mystique. How about mystique of crime in the 70s? Because we've there's quite a mini franchise of films and whatnot of bank robbers and things in this particular time frame, because it is sort of the last era before you have surveillance technology, which is so pervasive. A lot of times in this era, people are still doing these robberies without any kind of face covering or anything like that, because they think that, if you're a relatively average looking person, nobody's going to remember you in the moment. Mm-hmm. And that's, there is something, I hate to say nostalgic about that, but I guess it is a little bit of nostalgia. Yeah. The gentleman robber, I guess you might say.
Yeah.
In society, obviously we have a special place in our culture for that kind of thing, going back, to Robin Hood or whatever. But yeah, that's what, I think that's what's one of the best things about this book, is it takes me into that 70s period where these things existed, and you could, even if it is kind of a fantasy, you could exist in doing these things by these rules in the way that Leonard describes.
Yeah, it's in one way it's the last hurrah before the establishment of the Big Brother surveillance state. In another way, it's also the last hurrah. It's the end of the Wild West. It's like It's one of the last eras where the bandits can rob trains and get away with it before the law comes after him. And given that Leonard was cut his teeth on westerns, he wrote his first,
Good point.
many novels were westerns, and a lot of his, including he wrote 310 to Yuma, and other books that were turned into films. It feels like the 70s was an extension of that Wild West era, and that died with surveillance and in the official close of the West. I find that interesting.
That's a really good point, and something that we've talked about in the past. We claimed previously that the hard-boiled genre of the 20s and 30s was the closing of the West, but maybe in a way the 70s era really might be that thing. I mean, that sort of speaks to, if you replace the horse with the muscle car and
yeah, the Colt 6-shooter with a Glock, and it turned inward. The West was on the periphery, then it went back to the city, and it occupied the city until the city figured out how to surveil to an extent that it inhibited most of that sort of freewheeling theft and redistribution. But this was a pretty good example of that. It did feel like bandits on a robbery spree, having the time of their lives until things go wrong. Do we want to talk about specific robberies that, other than the one where they rob the guy who robs the bar, were there any particular moments in their robbery spree that stand out to you? Or do you want to talk about their meeting of Arlene or Arlette and Sport Tree?
The only two robberies to me that really stick out are one when they're robbing a liquor store with, I think they refer to him as the Armenian. And basically this is the moment where, like, if they're following these rules, and if they turn to violence here, this guy's very stubborn. He's not giving up the money. And basically if they want to get the money, they're going to have to become very violent, sadistic type criminals. And they don't go down that road, which I think that's interesting, because I think it does give us like the moral, even though these guys are crooks, like this is where where they draw the line. Now that's not to say there isn't murder in the book, but the killing that does occur, you could make the argument for self-defense there.
Yeah, I would say I think there are 4 or 5 killings in the book, and the first ones is something I already talked about, at least alluded to. Stickley's put in a position where he's looking to find a car to break into, and he has a grocery bag full of money from one of their robberies, and Ryan's elsewhere. He went inside already, and he gets robbed in the parking lot by 2 black men who think he's trying to get into his car, so they're trying to rob him of his car. So there's so many layers of robbers robbing each other in this book. It sort of speaks to the 1970s and maybe Detroit as a declining industrial space and a rising center for crime. But in this situation, he sort of defends himself. He tries to prevent violence from escalating, but these guys proceed, and they're going to make away with his money, and he ends up killing them both. And this is the first moment where he's sort of ruminating over this and saying, like, it was clear that this wasn't his intent. It was just the circumstances of the situation and life in Detroit. It ain't all swinging ladies and bags of money. There's also some trouble when you involve yourself in these types of criminal enterprises.
Yeah, for sure. And, that reminds me, I mean, I'm no expert on Detroit, but I've been there a few times, especially when I used to work on the Great Lakes. We'd go into some of the less desirable areas to get to the boat that was at the port. And it does remind me that Detroit has very different neighborhoods, from extreme wealth to extreme poverty. So that might actually explain their robbing a little bit more, just going in and out of neighborhoods. I guess the other heist that comes to mind is just really the final one.
Yeah.
And the one thing about this is that Frank and Stick make and Stick does protest to this plan, but they make such a deviation from their rules to conduct this final big heist robbery that it really calls into question, were they even competent? Was this all just kind of a lucky lark the whole way, where they just got lucky from over numerous robberies? Because this seems like such a poor idea from the get-go. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Well, I agree with that. If they were religiously sticking to these rules for some kind of long career of crime, then they would not have pursued this job. This felt like Ryan using his sort of slimy salesman charm to seduce Stick into pushing against his own rules that Ryan established for him. But it sort of speaks to the state we were in when we got the rules. They were loaded. They were drunk in a bar, and Ryan wrote them on a napkin. So so the question of whether or not Ryan was going to stick hard to these rules, or if he had ever stuck hard to them. I mean, rules look good in paper, but it takes a certain kind of character to act them through. And at first, I think Ryan held his own for a while, but that greed, that desire for more, that desire for the big payload that leave him living large for years to come, got the better of him. And I think that he was the weak link here, and Stick was a fool to follow him.
Yeah, so I do think that this is more a tale of incompetent crooks who get lucky for a time than it is, competent robbers to emulate. Is there anything else, Justin, you really want to talk about on the novel? Because I think what we're getting into here a little bit is Leonard's style, some of his writer's chops, and some of those elements. And I just, because that's so prevalent in how I think about the book, I wonder if we should really talk about that here.
No, I think we should transition, but I do want to mention just briefly so that the reader knows, we didn't really talk about what the big heist is. I won't spoil the ending, but I will say that the heist itself, Stickley agrees to meet with Frank's buddy, who is a criminal, somebody who's been committing crimes for a while, this gangster, and this gangster proposes this idea, and they start talking about robbing this big department store, which takes more than just the two of them. This isn't a Stick and Ryan job. This is going to be a crew, like a classic heist film. So you got 6 guys, and who vouches for them. All of a sudden, they're in a situation outside of their own control, and this is where Stick gets really uncomfortable. And obviously, when you're robbing a department store at the end of a Leonard crime novel like this, featuring 2 bumbling protagonists, it's not going to go according to plan, and it doesn't. And then there's a lot of he said, she said, there's a lot of finger pointing, there's a lot of backstabbery and other things, including a twist, which we won't talk about. But it's just incredible to watch it unfold. It is noirish because it's coming. It's not going to work out. You see it. And just like Stickley, you're with him going, oh shit, this is gonna fall apart, and we're gonna pay for this. And of course, it being noirish, that this comes to pass. And I thought that was fine. I'm never the biggest fan of conclusions that have the big moment, the sort of grandiose spectacle. I don't care about that, but I think this was handled fairly well, and it talked about some things that were important, including another couple guys biting the dust. So, is there anything you wanted to talk about in terms of the heist before we talk about Leonard?
No, not really. I actually don't. I mean, I find the aftermath of the heist kind of interesting, but I don't really find the heist that interesting, I guess.
Yeah, I agree. I think the small time robberies in the middle of the book were far more satisfying to me. I don't need a heist. I want to see guys bumbling from 7-Eleven to 7-Eleven robbing it, because that's something I don't see as often in novels, especially novels coming out of the 40s, 50s, and 60s, which preceded this one.
Yeah. Now, the transition here I'd like to make, Justin, is to talk about kind of rare for this particular, for Elmore Leonard. This book has never been adapted to the screen. It's never been made into a film. It's never been a TV movie or TV show or anything like that. Whereas Leonard has had over 30 movies made from his novels, Justified, the TV show, other adaptations. And this one, and the element of this writing is like, I think this would make if you change that heist around a little bit, like I think this would make an excellent movie. You have a pair of unlikely combo gets together. They have bumbling but successful crimes. They have these rules. I'm kind of reminded of Zombieland there, if anybody knows that one. These rules for these heists, they break the rules, they screw up, and we deal with the aftermath. That seems like, something that Hollywood would want to adapt. And that's, I think, both the interesting part of Leonard's body of work is that he has had so many adaptations, many of them unsuccessful, but yet there's still a lot of adaptations. And the other thing of how his writing is, and speaks to your thing about the dialogue, how the writing is so punchy, it is almost a movie script on its own. You wouldn't necessarily need to change that much to put it on the screen.
Oh, I agree with that. And I think this would be a great film. I think the character, the presence of character and the dynamics between a character like Ryan and Stickley as they agree to get along, they come to like each other, and then those little nuances start to tear and pull at them and break them apart. I think it would be an incredibly interesting film if you found the right guys for it. It also reminds me potentially of a film like Hell or High Water, which features two guys robbing banks in Texas because of a desperate need for money in order to pay off a major bill or a mortgage. But it creates these conditions of two guys who aren't necessarily seen eye to eye in how that plays out. I imagine that, I don't know if you've read many of his Western stories. I do have his complete Western stories of Elmore Leonard, which came out in 2004, I think. It's a great collection. I haven't read the whole thing. There's just dozens and dozens of stories in it, but you start to see his style early. You start to see his Hemingway influence early in the way that, while the Western stories aren't as dialogue rich at first as his crime fiction later, you see the seeds of his style in development early on. And I think movie folks back in the day saw that as well, because he was, unlike these guys who are struggling their whole lives until the big breakthrough, which is oftentimes the story people say about Leonard is, well, after 15, after 25 novels, he finally finds success. Well, he got his movies, his books, his short stories back in the 50s turned into movies. The Tall T, starring Randolph Scott, and 310 a Yuma, starring Glenn Ford. These weren't tiny movies. He was already pretty established. I think anybody starting off as a writer, having their short stories turned into movies within 10 years of your writing career, you would have to call that a success. But with the death of the Western in the 1960s, I think that's where he had to reinvent himself. He ran into trouble. He started drinking heavily. He had problems with his first marriage, which led to a collapse in the 70s. So I think he had a first wave of success, and then it all petered out. And he could have become a failed writer at that moment, but he figured out a way to sort of push through that. And one of those ways was reinventing himself as primarily a crime writer. I guess that's how I would think of his career in two acts.
I think that's well described. You're right. I mean, it definitely, the early success, there is definitely a lull. It seems, I don't know. We're not talking about it in the moment, but I imagine that there was a period that a lot of readers would have maybe known the name Elmore Leonard, then would have fallen out of favor, and then he reemerges as this crime writer, starting in 1969 with The Big Bounce, which was a gold medal original, and that was also made into, two terrible movies apparently, which I believe Leonard said the first movie was what he thought was the worst movie he'd ever seen, until the second one came out, and he said that was the worst movie that he'd ever seen. So
yeah, I don't think he was really a huge fan of most of the movies that used his books as inspiration. I'm curious what he would have thought of Raylan and Justified. I know some of that was out when he was alive, but I didn't read about his impressions of it.
Well, I didn't either, because I'm not real familiar with that particular series. Mm-hmm. I did read this thing about he was really concerned about the hat that the main character wears. He didn't think it was appropriate. But I did look at this article in The Atlantic called The Elmore Leonard Paradox, and it talks a little bit about Leonard's relationship with film. The Hollywood Reporter had called him the number 2 on their list of most powerful authors in Hollywood. He's been called the most cinematic novelist in the English language. And he has quoted himself to say, "I've always seen my books as movies." However, this article sort of goes into why there wasn't a huge, like a lot of these movies didn't get great reviews. I mean, I think 310 to Yuma is sort of a standout there. But a lot of his crime fiction, until Quentin Tarantino arrives on the scene, and the two of them, despite having some different approaches to things, there's a lot of parallels between Quentin Tarantino and Leonard, and that's particularly that starts with the popularity of Get Shorty,
Yes.
which I've seen. I don't know if you've seen. That's a great film.
Yeah, I saw that in the theater many moons ago, and I remember enjoying it quite a bit. And then of course, Jackie Brown came out in 1997, which is a variation on a theme of Leonard's novel Rum Punch. And Tarantino isn't sly about this. He's pretty direct. He says he owes a lot.
Yeah.
He owes a big debt to Leonard. He can't really hide this sort of flashy, spectacle heavy, dialogue driven inspiration, because they both have it.
I don't know. It sort of speaks to how Leonard was a little bit ahead of the curve in a new genre or a new era for Hollywood. I don't know.
I think there's some truth to that. I think he introduced, from the 50s, 60s into the 70s, there was a lot of heaviness. There was a lot of existential. There was a lot of noir. I think with the introduction of the blockbuster from Jaws and Star Wars and this sort of popcorn films that are all excitement and spectacle, I think he was on the cusp of that. I mean, I think his books do have depth and his characters can be very well developed, but he's also very much a popcorn writer. You can read him and not be interested in the depth and still enjoy the book, just watching these bumbling guys fuck around for 200 pages and get into trouble. It's enjoyable on that level as well, which is perfect for Hollywood, which has a pretty low IQ for entry.
Yeah.
In terms of the average Hollywood film. Yeah.
Sure. No, that makes a lot of sense. So I wonder if we'll see some new adaptations of this work or coming down the road, or maybe new visions of it. That would be interesting to see. Obviously, Justified was very, very popular. And, now maybe Leonard's estate will be looking to sell some of these things as new concepts. So maybe we have more transitions to the screen ahead.
Sure. And it isn't to say that he was only spectacle and in his latter half of the career and without like critical success. He also, in 1983, his novel La Brava, which was one of the first novels I read, got him an Edgar Award, and that was sort of the moment when he realized that his crime fiction career was paying off. With La Brava, that's when he started to get the big money. And then just less than 10 years after that, the Mystery Writers of America gave him the Grand Master Award, presented only to individuals who have proved themselves preeminent in the craft of the mystery and dedicated to the advancement of the genre. So he had finally eclipsed his Western past and was being rewarded by the mystery and crime fiction establishment. So that must have felt pretty good to him. So he could die relatively happy knowing that he had found success in two literary genres. I mean, that's a 2 for 2. And then he was able to say greenlight the Raylan project, the Justified series, which is arguably the best thing that's ever been done with his work in film. And if you mentioned that you hadn't really seen it, Kurt, it is really good. I haven't seen the whole one, but the whole series. But from what I've seen, the couple seasons I've seen it, it's good. I mean, it's high caliber writing craft and pretty dynamic, interesting characters and plots. So I highly recommend it.
Yeah, I've heard nothing but good things. It's just that it's one of those things where like there's too many seasons. I feel I have to make a big commitment.
Yeah, well, yeah, but you'll know pretty quick in season 1 if it's floating your boat, so to speak.
Sure. Well, yeah, there's no doubt that Elmore Leonard is a literary icon in the United States. As you mentioned, an Edgar Award winner, a Grandmaster. He won the F. Scott Fitzgerald Literary Award for Outstanding Achievement in American Literature. He's a Peabody Award winner and a National Book Award Medal of Distinguished Contribution Award winner. He's got like, it's like 60 some novels here, plus short stories. 30, like I said, 30 plus adaptations over the course of his relatively long life. He was born in 1925, died in 2013, like you said. He served in World War II. He was in the Navy. He was a Seabee, who, if you don't know what a Seabee is, they're the guys who go in and build aircraft landing strips overnight and stuff like that. Then he used that money to go to college, the University of Detroit, which he wrote about so well. And I do think that's one thing about Leonard. I think Leonard is at his best when he writes about places he's familiar with. Mm-hmm. He's familiar with Michigan. He's familiar with the Rust Belt. He's familiar with Florida. He's familiar with that type of America. And the disappointments that I've had with Leonard's work have typically been from books that depart from that. I read Djibouti not too long ago, and I didn't care for it. And, that's okay. He's got so many things to choose from and so many quality pieces of literature. Now, we are getting towards the end of the episode here, Justin. Did you want to talk about his 10 rules for writing?
Yeah, I'd like to talk briefly about his influence and some of his writing approaches, and then let's sum up with the 10 rules of writing. It's clear that Leonard's about rules. He likes coming up with rules in his stories, in his personal life, and his 10 rules of writing are terrific. I use many of them actually, and I teach them as well to my students. But in terms of his general writing style, Dennis McClellan in the New York Times, or the LA Times, talked about how Leonard wrote every day in his living room with a number 5 pilot pen on unlined yellow paper before typing the handwritten pages on an IBM Selectric. So he has a system. He has a specific pen, specific paper, and I'm sure plenty of writers out there who are trying to figure out what system works best for them understand this. Sometimes it's a little bit of magic, like a lucky rabbit's foot. Whatever system starts producing for you, you tend to stick with it. And about writing, Leonard said this in 1998, and this is right around Jackie Brown and Tarantino, so he's already achieved great fame at this point. He says, "The most satisfying thing I can imagine doing is writing a novel. To write that scene and then read it, and it works, there's nothing better than that." So writing for him was incredibly deep in terms of what it offered him, the satisfaction he got from it. And it's, the chronology of books that he put out there, that canon of work is a testament to the fact that he really loved falling into these worlds and creating them. And he influenced an incredible number of people, as much as he was influenced by Hemingway and James M. Cain. Crime writers like Pelecanos and Michael Connolly and Dennis Lehane and Laura Lippman all pay their tributes to him as being a major influence in their work. And of course, this new generation of writers, whoever we happen to be, can use his 10 rules of writing along with his 60 or so novels to inspire us and to guide us towards some new interpretation of the genre. But I'd like to share with you his 10 rules of writing. If you haven't read them already, here they are. Number 1, never open a book with weather. Number 2, avoid prologues. I've learned this one. Number 3, never use a verb other than said to carry dialogue. Number 4, never use an adverb to modify the verb said, he admonished gravely. Number 5, keep your exclamation points under control. You are allowed no more than 2 or 3 per 100,000 words of prose. Use them fucking wisely. Number 6, never use the words suddenly or all hell broke loose. Just show it. 7, use regional dialect or patois sparingly. 8, avoid detailed descriptions of characters. 9, don't go into great detail describing places and things. And 10, try to leave out the part that readers tend to skip. This is his sly wink at you. You have to know what that is in order to skip it, but the point still stands. And lastly, there's a bonus here. If it sounds like writing, he rewrites it. So if your writing sounds like it's been written by an author, it's probably being written too hard. So
I think that one is great.
I love it.
And I think that's what I think he captured. That point captures what is so interesting about his work, is that, and when I'm talking about how he makes something very complicated look easy, that's it. It doesn't feel like writing. But you can tell from those rules that Leonard was not a fantasy or science fiction author, though.
Yeah, he was definitely coming from the Hemingway school. Keep it simple, focused, cut out everything you can possibly cut out that doesn't further the plot or develop the character, which in the fantasy series that I've read is certainly not a rule that anybody recognizes, heeds, or even possibly comprehends.
Well, that's a great way to end, I think, our discussion on Elmore Leonard, the Dickens of Detroit. Do you have anything else you'd like to add, Justin?
No, I enjoyed this one, and I think I'm satisfied with our conversation about Leonard. I'd love to hear from listeners about our choice in swag, and if we were to read another one, what would it be? We both read Stick. I liked Stick okay. I didn't like it as much as I liked swag. But I also have a feeling that I'm going to like his Detroit fiction just a little bit more than I'm going to like his Miami fiction. So that's a personal preference.
Yeah, the short review for me too is Stick was good. It's missing something that swag has. It feels like Leonard really wanted to do more with the Stick character, and it just didn't quite work for me. However, it was I listened to it as an audiobook. It was a fun listen. Still recommended, just not as strong as swag. But I mean, and thank you to all the listeners who did provide suggestions. There's so many options with Leonard of what to read. We could have went a lot of different ways with this one. We just chose swag because something about it grabbed us. And we did both enjoy it. So there's lots of Leonard to check out.
I love the idea that swag wasn't turned into a film. It's nice to sit with a piece that we're not going to get see through the prism of some Hollywood director, and same for our listeners as well. I'm currently reading Unknown Man number 89. I know that was highly recommended by some people, so I'll let you know in the next episode what I think about that one. But so far I'm enjoying it. So
sounds good.
So what's next for us, Kurt? We're sort of at a strange point in our podcast history.
Yes. Before we close out here, Justin, I wanted to give two quick other media reviews, just some things I've seen lately that our listeners might enjoy. One's a TV show. This is called The Resort. I'm watching it through Peacock, the NBC streaming app. I think it's a Peacock exclusive, but I really like this. It has some crime fiction elements to it. It's not strictly crime fiction, but basically this struggling couple takes a vacation to Mexico at this resort. In the very first episode, one of them finds an old cell phone, and this unveils a mystery of two missing, not quite teenagers, I think 20-something-ish people. But there's elements of sort of mystery, maybe a little weirdness going on, maybe a little horror. It has elements of Wes Anderson, I feel like, to it. And then the other thing that I think, these are short episodes. There is a detective in this who is a great character, I think. He's an unusual detective. He's basically the resort's detective gets involved in this. And he's been a fan of crime fiction since he was a child. And that comes up in the plot. So you might want to check that out. That's The Resort. And the other thing, since we've had an episode on here on neo-noir and stuff like Blade Runner, I wanted to mention I've been sort of immersed in playing the game Cyberpunk 2077, which is a big video game RPG. Cyberpunk often has a lot of elements of noir and crime fiction and detective fiction to it. Now, this game is not exclusively that. So if that's what you're looking for, you can avoid this. But if you want that neon, rain-soaked cityscape, techno future, this game has it. The game had a lot of negative reviews when it first came out because it was buggy as all get out. It now seems like that has been 95% fixed, and it's not too bad. I'm enjoying the heck out of it. And there is a couple of detective quests, like side quest gigs in the game. One is actually named after Raymond Chandler. It could have been a little bit better, to be honest, but there are these detective elements in the game. Now, it's mostly, a lot of it ends up being like a stealthy kind of thing, or a shooter, or you're hacking or whatever, but you will get a couple of quests that are definitely inspired by crime and noir fiction. So if you're a gamer, you might want to check that out. It's also kind of relevant because I love how cyberpunk, and this touches on Leonard in the 70s, I love how cyberpunk in this vision diverges from what the world was like in the 70s and 80s, and what people in that time frame envisioned this cyberpunk future might look like. Because it's definitely more inspired by that time frame, the same time frame that Blade Runner came out, than it is modern stuff. But anyway, so Justin, coming up on these future episodes, that is a good question. What are we going to do next? Are we going to do Pimp by Iceberg Slim?
Yeah, that's the plan. Episode 70 is going to be Iceberg Slim's Pimp, which is a more an autobiographical novel or memoir. I haven't read it. I've heard good things about it. It came highly recommended. So I look forward to hanging out with Iceberg Slim and checking out this world that he crafts for us. After that, I know we sort of had a plan, and then because of life and our careers and all that, we were a little bit unsettled about how to proceed and what we should read after that. And I got stuck with, I'm not 100% clear what we settled on.
I'm not sure that we have, Justin. I think we need to figure that out. So I think we could say Pimp is next, and then we don't know where we're going from there.
And then we're going to surprise you. But we do have a few books that we talked about wanting to do, possibly a return to Ghana, possibly going back to the 1950s and finding some lesser heralded or unknown women noir writers from that era, including Vera Caspary. But we haven't settled yet. So if there are folks out there who are like, we're at episode 70, it'd be nice to get to 100. What would you want to see us cover in the next 30 episodes? Help us out in crafting the future, because we have some ideas, but clearly we would love some additional input if you have any.
That would be great to get some listener input. We're definitely open to that. If you've got suggestions of new or classic work, and if you want to get in touch with the show to share that, the best thing to do is send us an email, pointblanknoir@gmail.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Point Blank Hardboiled Noir and Detective Fiction. There's 2 sites. There's a group, which, I mean, honestly, it has all sorts of noir and crime fiction stuff on it right now, but that's mostly supposed to be for listeners of the show. And then there's our main page, which really doesn't have much other than new episodes posted on it. We're also on Twitter. You can get in touch with us there, although that's not our primary means. Do email us. We do check that. We will get back to you. So until next time, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time, folks. Point Blank is under a Creative Commons license. Music is by Justin. Copywritten works are property of their respective holders.